So this module we're talking about amines. We have encountered amines several times before in organic modules and also in our acid-base module. An amine is an organic compound in which you have a nitrogen that has a lone pair, and that lone pair of course features significantly in the chemistry of amines, and that nitrogen is bonded to 3 R groups, where R is just a usual old alkyl or a hydrogen. If you got anything fancy in R, if it's an OH or a C double bond O and so on, then it's a different type of compound. We don't call it an amine. General formula of amines: CN, H2N, not +2 now, but +3, because a nitrogen brings 1 extra hydrogen into the whole formula. If you think back to how we've talked about these formulas before, every extra carbon brings in 2 hydrogens, every oxygen brings in no hydrogens to the general formula, so nitrogen being between carbon and oxygen brings in 1. We classify amines according to whether they are primary, secondary or tertiary. And the primary, secondary or tertiary refers to how many R groups as opposed to H's that are attached to the nitrogen. Thus a primary amine has 1 R group on the nitrogen. The simplest primary amine is of course methylamine here, where it's just a methyl group attached there. Formula methylamine, we got 1 carbon, so if it's 1 carbon, 2N plus 3 is 5 hydrogens, as indeed there are 3 on the methyl group and 2 attached to the nitrogen. Secondary amines, of course, are ones in which there are 2 R groups and 1 hydrogen on the nitrogen. So the simplest secondary amine is one in which there's not 1 but 2 methyl groups on the nitrogen. So dimethylamine, formula of that C2H7N, because of course C2 multiply 2 by 2 you get 4 plus 3 is 7. And then, of course, just for completeness sake, let's do the tertiary amines. 3 R groups on the nitrogen, simplest one in which all of those are methyl groups, so trimethylamine, and formula C3H9N. Continuing on a little bit, I'm going to do some more examples to illustrate the different naming approaches and rules for naming amines. They're sometimes a little confusing, but hopefully you'll pick it up as we're going through quite well. This one here, where we have a 5-membered carbon ring with a nitrogen on the second one, the traditional way to name this is to just find the longest chain that contains the amine. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons with that amine, so that makes it butylamine, in which there is a methyl group on the first carbon, right? So that's a carbon there, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the first carbon of the important chain that's attached to the amine. So this 5th one is just considered to be a methyl group. The emphasis again, pick the chain, the longest chain that has the nitrogen in it. So we ignore this aromatic here. We say the nitrogen is on a 1,2 carbon chain, so it's an ethylamine. And then this phenyl group is attached to carbon 2, so 2-phenyl ethylamine. When we get to secondary, and in a minute we'll do tertiary amines, sometimes of course it's nice and easy, like here, both groups attached to the nitrogen methyl groups, 3 attached to the nitrogen were methyl groups. But what about this one here, where if we think about the nitrogen, it's got an ethyl group and a methyl group on it? Well, again, we pick the longer chain that contains the nitrogen. So in this case, it's a 1,2 carbon chain, which makes it ethylamine. And then we don't say it's 1 methyl. This is the 1 methyl here, where it's a 1 methyl attached to a carbon. We say that that methyl group is, of course, attached to the nitrogen. So we emphasize that by saying it's N-methyl, methyl group on the nitrogen, ethylamine. There's also a newer way to do it. I hesitated because I was trying to find the appropriate word. A slightly newer way to do things, which is that instead of talking about the groups attached as methyl and ethyl and so forth, you talk about the longest chain as if it were just an alkane that happens to have an amine attached to it. So this one here, for example, is methane with an amine on it, so methanamine. This one here is an amine or a pentane, 1, 2, 3, 4, because in this case it's a pentane that has an amine on it in the 2 position, so 2-pentamine. This one here doesn't change very much because of course the alkane would be 2-phenyl ethane, and so we just say, well, the amines on the end of the ethane. We can combine these different amine approaches for this secondary amine, for example, because again it is a methanamine but now has an N-methyl on it. So N-methyl, methanamine. And then this one here is methanamine, that has 2 methyls on it. So that would be N, N-dimethyl methanamine. So interpreting the formula from the name is relatively straightforward. Interpreting the name from the formula, a little bit difficult, and I'm not going to really harp on it too much, although of course we will have at least one question on the worksheet associated with that. Now, I did say earlier that amines were more important than this group here or this group here, but they're not really that important when it comes to the priorities for naming. So for example, imagine this compound here that is actually a rather important compound. It's got 2 carbons, one of which has an OH, one of which has an amine on it. Which one takes priority? Well, the answer is the alcohol takes priority. So it is 2-aminoethanol, according to the proper naming system, rather than 2-hydroxyethylamine. Okay. Now, the last little note on naming is that the aromatic primary amine, in other words, a primary amine in which R is a phenyl, is called aniline. And we will be talking about aniline or aniline quite extensively as we go through the different movies in this module. Anyway, some naming associated with amines. Most important thing is you recognize primary versus secondary versus tertiary. You got the rough idea of how we're naming it, and that you know that the NH2 attached to a benzene ring, the primary aromatic amine, is called aniline.